Alright, let's continue with our video lecture for Unit 5. We're in the third video now, looking at the second major concept of Unit 5 of the modern era. We're looking at imperialism and nation-state formations. So, let's talk about imperialism. Of course, the imperial powers are going to be the same as the industrial powers. And these industrial powers are going to search for territories and colonies throughout Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. We should also, of course, identify the fact that the old imperial powers, Spain and Portugal mainly, are going to become increasingly weaker and less important in world history during this time period. And not surprisingly, Spain and Portugal will not industrialize as much or as quickly as other countries, including Britain and the Netherlands and France and Germany and Russia. Those European nations are going to become quickly industrialized and therefore have the industrial capabilities of these new levels of imperialism during this time period. And of course, not far behind Europe is going to be the United States and Japan, as these new imperial powers are slowly taking shape. So we're going to see, of course, the colonization, the conquest, the imperial control of colonies all over the world, including the Dutch East Indies, which is this map that you see here, with the Dutch flag, and the British Raj of India in South and Southeast Asia. Now, of course, the United States is going to have its empire. It's going to start roughly in 1898 and be expand in the early decades of the 20th century. So here we see little bits and pieces of places like Puerto Rico, Cuba, Panama, Hawaii, the Philippines and Guam, and most of these territories, of course, the United States got after defeating Spain in the Spanish-American War. Japan, of course, is going to consolidate control over its islands during this time period, and then slowly start making headway into the Pacific, into Southeast Asia, into all these tiny little islands. And then also, of course, the main target is going to be East Asia, including Korea and China. Germany is going to be a latecomer to the imperial game, but they are going to have territorial possessions in Africa, as you see here. Right, bits and pieces of Africa are going to be under the German Empire. So how did the Europeans, how were they able to accomplish this? Well, it's a combination of both warfare and diplomacy. So yes, the Europeans went in there, guns blazing, machine guns firing, steamships, steam gunships, bombarding places in Africa. But it was also through diplomacy. So, for example, when the Belgians first made their way into the Congo, they would go tribe by tribe and have the chiefs of the tribes sign off on these treaties, and the chiefs would get some money or some trinkets or some manufactured goods, and in return they'll sign away all the rights to their land and their resources. And then they would trick these kind of chiefs into signing these off, because most of the chiefs, of course, were illiterate, because writing systems weren't really that common in sub-Saharan Africa. So it was a way to kind of trick people into giving away their lands, and then using these contracts as kind of justification to bring in violence when the people resist the imperial takeover. The same kind of process actually occurred here in the United States. Numerous times the United States government made treaties with Native Americans, and many of the times these treaties were signed by people who weren't literate and weren't really fully aware of what they were signing. And it was kind of a way of taking advantage of people. So this is kind of the diplomacy that we see kind of set up that the Europeans would use and take advantage of many African tribes and regions. And eventually they're going to, with the arrival of industrial power and machine guns and steamships and railroads, the Europeans are going to make their way into different parts of Africa and set up their colonies there. The big some of the most famous abuses of the African people, of course, occurred during the They're in the scramble for Africa, right, where the Europeans are scrambling to get a hold of African territories, and we see, numerous cases of violence and abuse against African people, including, having your hands chopped off because of what the Belgians were doing under King Leopold. We also see, this idea that Africa was kind of like this metaphor that Africa was like this big cake, and all the European countries wanted to have their slice of it, because each slice, of course, is going to be filled with natural resources like gold and ivory and oil, and all of these, which of course are going to be in high demand in Europe. Now, some Europeans had settler colonies. In other words, a lot of people from the mother country, like France or Britain, are going to migrate and settle down in other parts of the world. The famous examples, of course, include the British colony of South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. So, keep in mind, places like Australia and New Zealand, most of the people living there now are white, are English speakers, and again, they are descendants of those British settlers. In Algeria, which is part of North Africa, we had a lot of French people living there. And there's a lot of Algerians living in France nowadays. Right? So there is that connection to this, contemporary era. Of course, this is the famous industrialist, famous business owner, famous supporter of imperialism. His name was Cecil Rhodes. He's the one that had those countries, Rhodesia, named after him. All right, other parts of the world we see that are not industrialized, of course, we see that economic imperialism is going to take place, and that is, of course, when you don't completely conquer an area, but you have a lot of influence in its economies. So the famous examples, of course, include China, how China was never really conquered, like, say, India or Africa or Australia, but it was definitely under spheres of influence, right? The British are going to be the first ones, the French are going to come right after them, and then you have Japan and Germany and Russia all take their part of China under their spheres of influence. Now, we also see that the United States and Great Britain are going to have a lot of influence in Latin America. And a lot of American or United States and British companies are going to have a lot of wealth and property ownership in Latin America through investments. And many times, especially in the case of the United States, we are going to see the United States is going to intervene or get involved in Latin American politics whenever their business interests might be at stake. Other examples of this kind of like economic version of imperialism will be the relationship between Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Ottoman Empire attempted to industrialize, but in order to do so, they had to take out tons and tons of loans, and the Europeans would loan money to the Ottomans. In return, the Europeans will be granted capitulations, right, where the Ottomans had to pay back extreme amount of interest rates and offer all these like unfair treaties to the Europeans. And also, of course, we see the practice of extraterritoriality. Same thing happens in China, by the way. That is when a foreigner lives in your country but does not have to follow your laws. And so Europeans living in the Ottoman Empire did not have to follow the laws and the rules of the Ottoman Empire. All right, let's keep going here quickly. The United States, of course, is going to help open up, quote unquote, open up Japan to this global trade networks that are being set up during this time period. We see the emergence of the Meiji Restoration in Japan. And of course, the Meiji Restoration was a reaction to the arrival of the West, of the United States and Europe. And the Meiji Restoration was an attempt to modernize Japan, and they were quite successful in modernizing Japan, unlike what happened in China, where the Chinese failed to do that, and therefore they were conquered. Japan was much more successful, and therefore they were able to resist this foreign influence. So of course, here we see the picture of Commodore Matthew Perry. He's the guy who led the American Navy into Japan. Here we see this was the Shogun, I believe, at that time, and other paintings of the arrival of the Americans. Again, these American warships come in. They have these huge cannons, these huge artillery, awesome firepower, so much that the shogunate basically collapses because they are unable to resist this military threat. We know that the expansion of land-based states is going to continue. So, for example, the United States is going to start off on the East Coast, on the Atlantic coast, with the 13 original colonies and states. And over the 1800s, over the 19th century, we're going to see that westward expansion under the belief of manifest destiny, right? That America should go from coast to coast. Same thing's going to happen in Russia, except they're going to be moving eastward across Siberia and into parts of Central Asia. That's going to be their movement. So don't think that Europeans were the only ones expanding their empires or borders or territories, right? United States, Russia, and also China is going to be these big land-based empires. Now, of course, we know China is going to weaken and to the point of collapse by the end of the 1800s. But in the earlier half of this time period, remember we go from 1750 to 1900, Qing China was still expanding, and they're going to go into Korea, they're going to go into Tibet, and they're going to go into Central Asia. So in fact, the modern day map that we see of modern day China was roughly that was the size of the Qin dynasty. And China, of course, is one of the largest countries in the world to this day. So again, here we see the Americans moving westward, the Russians moving eastward, expanding across, and of course any natives living in any of these open areas are going to be moved out of the way. Here we see a famous painting about the progress, this belief that moving westward was this kind of like guided by God mentality, and that the Americans were blessed with all this land and all these resources, and they were taking full advantage. So you see in the background, of course, we have all these settlers and pioneers moving westward, but don't forget that right behind them come the railroads, come industrialization, and to some extent also comes slavery. Now, we mentioned, of course, that as these empires are expanding and growing, the people that are expanding are going to resist quite a bit. And in this case, we see that the Ottoman Empire, even though it is a land-based empire, it's actually growing to weaken. In other words, it's going to contract, meaning it's not going to expand, it's actually going to lose territory, unlike Russia, unlike China, or unlike the United States. And part of the reason is going to be nationalization or nationalism. So we're going to see independence movements in Greece, for example, how the Greeks are going to demand independence from the Ottoman Empire and fight a war of independence similar to the United States versus Great Britain, but now it's the Greeks versus the Turks. Similar nationalist movement is going to bring some independence to Egypt and independence to the Balkans. The Balkans, of course, is that peninsula in southeastern Europe, where a lot of Slavic people live. They're going to fight for independence from the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottomans are actually going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. Then, and eventually, we see that by World War I, which is roughly 1914, they're only going to control parts of the Middle East, right? But in the past, they used to have North Africa. They used to have the Balkans over here, that's Southeast Asia. But by the beginning of the contemporary era, 20th century, we're going to see there is going to shrink quite a bit. We also should mention that there's going to be creations of new states during this time, and many of these states are going to be on the edges of other empires or other states. So, for example, there's going to be the Zulu Kingdom in South Africa. The Zulus are going to go to war against the British and have some success against the British for a while. When this Zulu Kingdom was created, as a state, unified against the British in expansion. Another one would be Siam, or modern-day Thailand. Thailand, of course, is quite unique because it was the only region in Southeast Asia that was not conquered, was not colonized, and Thailand is going to remain independent during this era, partly because they opened up their borders and adopted Western culture, and invited the Western powers to kind of like help them expand their economy and trade more. So very similar story in Thailand that we see in Japan. However, Thailand is not going to industrialize, which Japan did. So there are going to be new countries, new states being formed, and again, they're going to be in close connection to a imperial power. So the United States is going to be, well, the Cherokee Nation, that's the famous one. The Cherokee Nation is going to be formed roughly where Oklahoma is now, and eventually the Cherokees themselves are going to be forced to relocate over and over again. All right, other spreads of nationalism. Of course, nationalism is one of those big ideological beliefs about, you know, the importance of your country and your national identity, and that bond between people living in a similar or close proximity to each other. And these new ideas are going to kind of create new governments, create new states. So, for example, the nation state of Germany is going to come into creation for the first time. There was never a Germany before in world history. There were German people and German culture and German identity, but those people were living in different states, different empires, like the Holy Roman Empire, for example. But now we see that there is going to be a Germany, and that is going to be created in the late 1800s. We see that sometimes the nationalism is created as a response to imperialism. So, for example, the people of Algeria, they were never unified. They were broken up into smaller tribal communities. And now they're going to unite as Algerians against the French. Same thing's going to happen in India, how the Indian National Congress is going to lead the nationalist movement for independence against the British. And again, similar process is going to happen in the Philippines, where the Filipinos are going to unite in an attempt to get rid of the Spanish or the American colonizers. So sometimes, again, nationalism is created as a result of imperialism. And we see that again throughout the colonial parts of the world. Finally, let's talk about justification of imperialism. We should identify that racist beliefs and ideologies were used to justify, to prove that imperialism was appropriate, was fine. The famous example, of course, includes social Darwinism, right? The belief that the industrialized parts of the world, the Western parts of the world, have proven their superiority because they industrialized, and therefore it was natural for them to conquer and rule, and rule over the parts of the world that were not industrialized, the parts of the world that they considered to be non-civilized or uncivilized. Very closely tied to social Darwinism, we have the cultural belief of the white man's burden, based, of course, on Rudyard Kipling's famous poem, where he argues that it is the responsibility, or the moral responsibility, the duty of the Western powers, of the industrial powers, to spread modernization and spread civilization to what was considered the uncivilized world. And of course, we have this famous picture of Uncle Sam and the British version of Uncle Sam carrying, Cubans and Filipinos and Africans and Native Americans, and carrying Indians and Chinese and Muslims and Turks, carrying them up this mountain leading to the goal, which of course is civilization. And this burden, this hard journey, is the responsibility of the Western powers. So that's what they use to make themselves feel better about the fact that they're going around conquering, killing a whole bunch of people. All right, so that is it for nationalism. That is it for the formation of nation states. And I'll see you next time for the next video. And Caroline ruined everything.
You're so mean.